Hello, I'm Melissa from the Business Insight Center at the Central Library of Rochester in Monroe County. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please remember to mute your microphones and you can enter any questions into the chat. Just a reminder, all services of the Business Insight Center and Carlson Center for Intellectual Property are free and available by appointment only. I would like to now introduce you to Chad from the Consumer Credit Counseling Service of Rochester.
Excellent. Thank you, Melissa. Great to be here with you all. We really appreciate the opportunity to partner with the Business Insight Center. Always been a fantastic collaboration, and we're happy to be here today to talk about an important topic, which is managing personal finances during challenging times. No matter who we are or what we might be going through, it's something that we all face at some point in our lives. So very important to just build an understanding of some of the things we should continue to be aware of and be more mindful of that will help us to work through those difficult points in time. So again, my name is Chad Rifflin. I work as the Director of Programs and Grants for Consumer Credit Counseling Service of Rochester. And first, just wanted to give you a little bit of background on who we are and why we're here today. So we are a local nonprofit financial counseling organization. We've been in existence since 1970, and we are actually the only locally rooted nonprofit financial counseling agency here in Rochester. We essentially help folks to build financial health and financial wellness, and we accomplish that primarily on two tracks. We offer targeted financial counseling, obviously, which is free to the public to come in and get a one-on-one session to get help with their budget or their credit. And then we also do a lot of targeted and specific financial education like we're doing today to empower people to understand things that they need to know that will help them to be in better control of their finances. We're also a member of the National Foundation for Credit Counseling, which is the largest organizing body of nonprofit financial counseling organizations. We're licensed by the New York State Department of Financial Services, licensed by HUD, and we're also a member of the Better Business Bureau. So again, we're happy to be here today to bring you what resources and knowledge we can to encourage you with your personal finances. First, I'll say this: personal finances is a huge topic. There's lots of facets to it. It's something that impacts and affects each of us uniquely. So some of the things we're not going to do today is judge you or tell you exactly how you should be spending your money or saving your money. That is not what we are all about, nor is it something that we found to be effective in actually helping folks to achieve the goals that they want to achieve. But what I want to do today is to offer you some structure, some thoughts, some reminders, some ways of being mindful about your finances that will help you get to the end goal that you want to get to, that you feel fits with your values and the things that you want to accomplish. So we're going to go over 5 main things that I feel will be helpful along those lines today. Number one, we're going to talk about strategies for building an emergency budget and budgeting in general. A lot of these things, again, won't be rocket science, but they'll be good mindfulness pieces, things that will bring back to our recollection that we might need to become more aware of or become more deeply rooted in, and how we can get that in place if we need to. Secondly, we'll talk about ways that we can avoid more debt piling up if we are facing an emergency situation or facing some financial challenges at this point in time. We'll go over some useful resources and how you can take advantage of those, and some places that we can focus on making some negotiations and some plans to keep things on track. And with that, how we can protect our financial future, and then how we might be able to help you. As I'm rolling along, I'll pause after each of these sections to see if there's any questions. If you have a question, what you can do is you can pop it right in the chat. And once we get to one of those points in between each of these sections, Melissa will read those off and I'll be able to answer those for you. But we'll also have a specific Q&A time right at the end if you want to ask questions then. So we want to make sure we tailor this to everyone's needs as well. So first, we're going to jump right in talking about strategies for building an emergency budget. Now, again, I want to recognize the fact that when we have to face a moment where we need to make difficult decisions about our finances, we're facing a crisis or emergency, it can take many different forms, and it will feel very pressing and very challenging for all of us. The one thing we want to talk about today that will be helpful is some of the things that we can establish that will help us to move forward and mitigate and minimize the negative impact that that might have. I do not claim to have any kind of magical answer or magical wand through this that's going to make all those challenges go away, but we have found a lot of these things to be very helpful, again, to keep the impact of those difficult times as minimal as possible. So the purpose of an emergency budget obviously is to help us to, again, bridge that gap as best as we can and to keep moving forward, even though things might not be ideal and in the current situation. We know that in that time, every dollar is going to count. We have to figure out how to stretch it as far as we can, but at the same time, recognize that we are human beings and we need to maintain certain things about ourselves as human beings that are of more priority and importance than just figuring out how to be as frugal as possible. So I want to put that out there as well, that our own mental health, our own physical health, etc., has to be the main priority above just being as frugal as possible and saving every dollar as possible. One of the things right off the bat that can be very helpful is to figure out how we can automate more things within our budget so that we are not as overwhelmed with all of the various decisions that we need to make during these times to stay on track. So that's kind of the number one thing that can be an overarching objective or strategy, if you will, that will be a good foundation to build off of, is figuring out what's a good smart way to automate a lot of our payments, etc., so that we're not as forced into decision overload. Having the right mindset, of course, will also be very important. One thing we talk about very often in any of our budgeting sessions is how we structure our budget and our money management so that it fits with the things that are most important to us, kind of like I was just alluding to a moment ago. So it's very crucial to first consider what are our values, what are the goals that we really have at this point that will empower us to move forward to get in that better financial position that we want to be in. And doing so, we know, is not only going to impact us and help us to bridge that gap, but perhaps be an example to other people in our circle of trust that can also witness that work that we're doing and benefit from that as well. So figuring out the thing that's going to give us that positive motivation to move forward once we've kind of worked through a lot of those challenging feelings will actually make a big difference. So I'd encourage you to think about some of those things that you truly value and what is it that you want to get out of this? What's the goal that you have? After that, it's also very helpful to feel like we are getting in a space where we can be organized and that we're not having the sense of chaos and being in a cluttered space. So one thing that a lot of financial experts will recommend is creating a specific space for your money management actions. This could be, one certain desk or space in a room that you clear out and you just have your resources there for managing your finances. You declutter that space and declutter, other spaces in general that might create that sense of anxiety that things are more out of control. So often organized space helps us to feel like we are able to be in more control. And that's why it's such a helpful psychological boost to do this when it comes to our finances. So again, as I said, might be beneficial to you to think about having a designated spot in your home to start managing these types of things and to start digging into what we're going to be talking about throughout this section here. So first thing we would need to do to build our emergency budget is prioritize and list the things that we know we need to address, or the things that are just creating concern for us right now, the things that are kind of popping up in our mind that we know we just can't kind of get away from, because those are the things that are probably in the greatest need to be addressed. And then we want to go through those things and really ask ourselves clearly, what needs the most attention? What's the biggest challenge that we're facing right now? If we can find some ways to address those things, even if it's one or two, we're probably going to start to feel a little bit of relief that will give us that momentum, give us that push to move forward with the other things that we need to tackle as well. Of course, one of the things that will help us to overcome that stress that I mentioned is determining our balance between our income and our expenses so that we really know what we're working off of. We have a clear picture of what's in front of us and what needs to be done, what are the issues that are underlying our overall structure of our monthly income and expenses. That's how we're going to be able to make the most of every dollar, as we talked about before. So step one would be to determine our monthly take-home pay. So we're talking about the money that actually comes into our household in a 1 month period that we can actually use to address our expenses as well as the costs that we have for bills, etc. To do that, we might want to review pay stubs from the past several months, especially if our pay fluctuates for paid hourly, etc., and to get an average of what that typically is. From there, we want to know what we need to cover our expenses. And in this case, if we're talking about an emergency budget, we want to be able to understand what do we really need to get by with our most important expenses. Often those would be the things that would be considered fixed expenses. In other words, there's a single fixed monthly payment that we usually have to make for those expenses, like our mortgage, rent, loans. Sometimes we might have a fixed payment for utilities if we have it set up that way, etc. Those are typically the things that we know are number one priority, as well as food, etc. And we want to kind of compile exactly what it is we need to cover those basic expenses first. So that's our immediate consideration after we figured out what our take-home pay is. So we're going to talk a little bit about some ways that we can keep some of these kind of quote priority obligations on track. As I mentioned, mortgage, rent, car loans, utilities, the obvious things that we know need to be kept in place. When it comes to utilities, we can actually contact our utility company and see if they can put us on an adjusted payment plan for a period of time. This can be affected by a number of different things, but it's still worth investigating and seeing if we can negotiate. I think off the top, we get into this particular issue here. One thing to really be aware of is that a lot of these things are negotiable. And while that can be uncomfortable for us at first, it is well worth the effort to call and see what is possible and to really be assertive and express exactly what our situation is and sincerely why we feel we might need some consideration or some help. Even simple things like asking a utility company or any other creditor for an adjustment in a due date, or seeing if they have some sort of hardship payment plan. So that's another big strategy with our payment plans or with any monthly payments that we're making during an emergency time, especially if it's due to an income reduction or health issue, and we have documentation of that. Almost every organization has some sort of hardship payment program that will help us to reduce, lower, or even suspend our payments for a period of time. And a lot of companies have extended this further due to the COVID crisis, and some of them are still doing that to this point in time. So that's number one. What we want to understand is we can ask for lower payments due to some sort of an emergency or situation that we're facing currently. Once we have a better handle on some of those fixed expenses, then we also want to have an understanding of our flexible expenses. So those are the things that often might change from week to week, month to month, because of what's going on, like our groceries, our gas, etc. And there's a number of different things that we can consider. Big thing to start with a lot of these is to really track them and understand what those true costs are, especially when it comes to groceries and food expenses. That has gone up quite considerably, as most of you, I'm sure, are well aware of. But having that understanding as to what the true cost is the first step to taking control over those specific expenses. One thing we really recommend doing to accomplish that goal is to journal your expenses. So for 1 week, you can actually have a notebook or some other way of capturing that information in a cell phone, etc. And every time that you might spend money on those specific flexible expenses, you write it down for that day. So you have a daily running total, which leads up to a weekly total, and then you can multiply that out to see what the monthly impact is for those flexible expenses. Another great way to go is to check your receipts if you keep those, or your past bank statements that might show debit card purchases if that's your method for a lot of your purchases. That will help us to really get a good handle as to what kind of an impact those flexible expenses are making, and quite often they're making a much bigger impact than we consider. So we know how we need to create some boundaries, create some healthy limitations on our spending with those particular items, how we can plan out grocery lists or other types of lists, or maybe even little allowances for ourselves to keep those things in line during this time. Another area that does not get considered as often would be periodic expenses. So those are the things that we know occur, but they don't occur on a regular basis, like our fixed expenses or our flexible expenses that we just went over. So as you can see, this is things like repairs or medical expenses and the general unexpected thing that comes up. One thing we can always expect is the unexpected, and it can be difficult to prepare for those types of things. And this is where an emergency savings comes in, or some sort of allotment for those types of expenses that we contribute on a regular basis to set aside. So you might want to go back and add up how much some of those things amounted to over the past year, divide that by 12, and we can get a monthly allotment that we might want to set aside to have on hand for those types of expenses so that we don't get thrown off by them. And that's usually a good strategy. It won't be perfect. It's always difficult to deal with emergency expenses, but having something that we're contributing to that, if we can, is always better than nothing, so that we're not, again, falling further behind when those things come up. I know that there's been a lot of discussion over the years that many of us have heard about how much to set aside for emergency savings and these types of expenses. And my experience and what I've shared with a lot of folks is that I don't think we should get too hung up on some of the philosophies about, you should have 3 to 6 months of your living expenses set aside, because we really never know how much we need. And it probably makes more sense to just continuously build on any emergency savings that we have, because again, something is better than nothing. And there's no reason why we should just stop contributing to that once we hit a certain limit, if we ever got to that point. So that's how I would encourage you to think about building up some sort of fund or some sort of reserve for those periodic expenses, so that it can be helpful to us when those things do occur. Then what we want to do is essentially kind of calculate, how much we need to set aside, how much we have for our income versus our regular monthly expenses, and see what that difference is. So for example, if we added up all of the monthly expenses that we need to cover to stay on track and stay afloat, and it was, I'm just going to throw out a number, it's $2,500 a month, and we calculate our take-home pay, and our take-home pay is $2,300 a month, well, then we have a deficit, and we know we need to still rework some things. Or if it comes out to be the opposite, where our income is $2,700 a month, and we've got this extra $200 a month, well, now we know we can try to direct that extra money towards, the emergency reserves, etc. So that's what that whole exercise and activity should help us to do. I know that it's a pain in the neck. It's not the funnest thing to do. It can definitely bring up a lot of things that cause us to be anxious. But the good news is there's help available, and we're going to talk about that at the end. And sometimes it can be very beneficial to have someone in your corner who regularly works on these kinds of things, that can lead you through that process and guide you through, help you to have a different perspective than you might typically have on your own. And that's what organizations like ours are there for. All right, some money savings tips as well. When it comes to spending, sometimes we might want to take a look at what we're spending on extras, maybe some of the subscriptions that we have in place that can come out automatically. And before you know it, that can really add up as well. It becomes like out of sight, out of mind. And before we know it, we have these expenses being taken out that we're not really considering what kind of an impact that is making. So that's another area to go back and check in your bank statements or check in your bank account online and see if there are subscriptions that maybe we have not thought of or we forgot about, that we can adjust periodically, maybe just for a short period of time, that will help us to keep some of these smaller things on track. The other thing that I would say is, know yourself, right? So if there's certain practices that cause us to spend more, then we want to adjust accordingly. So for myself personally, I think I'm kind of the opposite of many people, where if I have cash in my wallet, I will spend that way too easily, because to me, it feels like I have extra money to spend for some reason. Whereas if I have no cash in my wallet and I have the debit card, I don't like taking the debit card out and spending that money, because I feel like I'm taking things out of my bank account and I don't want to do that. For other folks, I know it's the opposite, right? Where if they have the card, it doesn't feel like they're spending money. And if they have the cash, it feels like they're giving something up, and they don't like to do that. So, know yourself and try to adjust your practices accordingly. And that will also make a big difference in the long run. Unfortunately, we also might have to kind of reconsider some of the other goals that we've had for long-term savings, and how we might want to convert our savings to some emergency funds to bridge us during this time. I know that's kind of goes without saying, but it's a good reminder once again to take a look at those kinds of things as well. Think about stimulus funds or tax returns and what's going to be the best use for those. And also, again, get in touch with folks who can help us to work through some of those kinds of important decisions. I've been kind of talking about this throughout this whole process here, and I alluded to it in the very beginning as well, which is the importance of money mindfulness throughout any of these strategies or tactics that we put in place. I always mention this, and I forgot to in the beginning, but everyone manages money a little differently. And I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of people, and all kinds of folks who've used different practices. I don't know if I've ever worked with two people who've managed their money exactly the same. But the thing that would help someone to be successful in managing their money really boils down to a few things. Number one, they built the construct to be very aware of what's happening in their finances. So they had things in place that helped them to have a really high awareness of what was going on. Secondly, they were able to employ some tactics and some tools that helped them to stay disciplined and accountable to what they were trying to accomplish. And thirdly, they had a vision for where they wanted to be, where they wanted to go. And all of those things really helped them to be more mindful of their money management practices overall, to reduce distractions, handle those kinds of things better, and to stay on track. So that's another thing to consider as you're working through this. How can you be more mindful? How can we be more aware and have a more healthy mindset about our finances and how we can get through these difficult, challenging times? So I know we went over a lot there. There's quite a bit that we could dig into a lot further, but we want to make sure we cover kind of a broad range of areas here today. But I'll pause and see if there were any questions that anybody might have had, or things that you'd like me to kind of dig in a little bit deeper on. So Melissa, does it look like we have any questions? No questions? All right, fantastic. So once again, as a reminder, I'll pause after each section, just like I did here. If you have questions, be happy to address them, or we'll do Q&A at the end. So now we're going to kind of transition from that to talk about, okay, we know we're in a challenging time. We might be facing a certain emergency. And of course, that can and will likely lead to greater amounts of debt if we need to rely upon that. So how do we avoid more debt, or how do we at least make sure we're reducing that impact of adding to our debt as much as possible? Well, one place you can start is by going to this very quick debt monster quiz. And this is a kind of a lighthearted way to help us understand what appropriate services might be there to assist us as we start working through our debt. I'm going to put this website in the chat so you can check it out on your own time. But as you can see, it's just debtmonsters.org. And this is a website that was created by a few nonprofit financial counseling organizations. We were one of those. It's completely anonymous, but it directs you to appropriate resources and gives you some great insights about your own situation. So I'd highly encourage you to check that out and start there. Secondly, another place of evaluation to go to first is annualcreditreport.com. I'm going to put that in the chat as well. And annualcreditreport.com is the site that was set up by the federal government to give us the free access to our credit reports that we're entitled to by law. Normally, we'd be able to get one free report from each of the 3 credit reporting agencies every 12 months. So we'd be able to get a free one from Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. So we'd get 3 free reports each year. Well, right now, until actually this month, we were able to get a free credit report on a weekly basis because of the pandemic. What we want to make sure of when we check our credit report is that we truly understand what debt we have, what the balances are, what's being reported on us, and also to make sure that all of that is being reported accurately, and to take steps accordingly if it's not being reported accurately. So that will help us to really get a handle on what debt we owe and how to address that debt. And I'm going to talk about some repayment plans in just a moment here. So I'm going to kind of also fold this into how we take advantage of useful resources in managing our debt. Now, a lot of creditors are still offering, and actually always have, but they've extended a lot of their forbearance plans and deferment plans. So they're a little bit more flexible on some payment terms during this time. So as I mentioned with even our utilities and other expenses like that, when it comes to mortgages, student loans, auto loans, credit cards, they also will maintain hardship programs. And depending upon the type of loan that it is, there can actually be regulations around that. So when it comes to a mortgage, the foreclosure process requires several steps. And within that, it requires financial institutions to ensure that they're taking proper steps to mitigate foreclosure, to actually stop homes from going into foreclosure. So if you are facing a challenge paying your mortgage, or even think you might be facing a challenge paying your mortgage, it's actually very beneficial to contact your mortgage servicer and to let them know that, because they are obligated to a degree to connect you with organizations that can help you. Or you can reach out to a nonprofit financial counseling organization like ours, and those organizations can connect you to those specific programs. But again, this goes back to understanding that those are options in place and reaching out to negotiate accordingly. So real quickly, a forbearance basically means that we don't have to make payments for a specific period of time. So it might be several months, and depending upon the forbearance that an organization might offer, they might offer a forbearance where no interest accrues, or they might offer a forbearance where we don't have to make the payment, but interest continues to add up. So that's something that we have to consider. And what we want to ask ourselves in that situation, if we're considering accepting a forbearance from our mortgage company, auto lender, student loan company, etc., is number one, will I owe more overall? So if interest is going to continue to add up or accrue, we're going to owe more in the end, and we need to weigh whether or not that's worth it to us. It might be, it might not be. We also need to ask how it might affect our credit and the credit that is available to us, and our credit score. So within those 2 areas there, the creditor might say, you know what, we can place a forbearance on the payments of this credit card, but we're going to ask you to close the credit card. So that can have some implications on our credits. We want to just make sure we understand exactly what those terms are and what actions are going to be taken, and ask how it might then impact our credit score. Typically, if something is in an accepted payment plan, which a deferment or forbearance would be an accepted payment plan, it might be reported to our credit report, but it's not going to have a negative impact on our credit score. On the other hand, the result of some of those actions can impact our credit score, like the fact that the balance is still growing, or the fact that we've eliminated a credit limit that was available to us compared to our balance, and there's some implications to our credit score behind that. Again, a credit counselor can help you to work through all of that. They'll understand the fine-grained details of some of those issues. but make sure that you ask those questions about how that's going to be reported so that you can dig in a little bit deeper and make that decision as to whether or not that's right for you. Again, understand that forbearances and deferments differ from financial institution to financial institution. So deferment is very similar, where it means, our payment could be suspended for a period of time or reduced for a period of time. So deferment could include the reduction of payment over a period of time. So same message here, make sure that you read the fine print and understand how the payment structure is going to be in place for that. Specifically with student loans, we wanted to call out the fact that if you weren't aware, but this has been on the news quite a bit, as of today, April 19th of 2022, federally funded student loans, the repayment has been suspended until August 31st of 2022. And with that, interest will not accrue. You can always go to studentaid.gov to get more information about that. I'm going to put that in the chat as well. They always post updates regarding any student loan repayment changes. So make sure you use that as a resource if you have student loans that you need to manage. The other thing to understand here is this does not apply to private student loans. So if somebody received a student loan from a financial institution rather than through the federally funded student loan program, then they'd have to contact that lender to understand what their options are. When it comes to mortgages, contact your lender, as I mentioned before, to see if there are deferments and forbearances available. And again, make sure you understand those terms. I kind of got ahead of the game talking about that before, so we won't spend too much time there. If you don't have a mortgage and you're paying rent, there's been a lot of misinformation about the suspension of rent payments as well as evictions. And it's very important to understand that we're still obligated to make our rent payments during this time, even when there are suspensions to evictions that are put in place. But there are often local resources that exist to help with back rent and to help people to avoid being evicted. So another great site to go to for that is the one that you see on the screen. It's consumerfinance.gov, and they will have periodic updates if there are any federal actions taken about rent payments. If you again are struggling with your credit card payments, we actually assist consumers who are working to repay their credit cards to get on track with the repayments, and we negotiate with credit card companies to get reduced interest rate and better payment terms. We've done this since our inception, and it's a service that's helped people to save thousands and thousands of dollars in interest and to improve their credit and to get back on track. So if that's something that might be of interest to you, or you feel like you have credit cards that you're struggling to pay, I'm going to put our website in the chat as well. And you can go to the contact us part of that page, and you can set up an appointment right through our website. We would be happy to help you along those lines. If you're currently in a deferment and you know that it's going to be coming to an end, again, be aware of that and make sure that you're understanding the implications of that to your budget and how you might need to adjust accordingly. I'm going to now just pause to see if there are any other questions, and then we're going to dive into our last section and go to our Q&A.
Well, this might come up later. We could save it for the Q&A.
Right.
But what would you recommend for people who are considering taking out like emergency payday loans and things like that?
Okay, that's a very good question. So payday loans are not legal in New York State, but there are other forms of loans that people might still be able to access that are similar. And through the power of the internet, sometimes they can stumble across those types of products. If you are going to leverage some sort of loan to bridge your income over a period of time, again, it's very important to understand what the cost of that loan is going to be. Those are typically very high interest loans, and the expense typically comes where the loan can be revolved, where essentially, after a period of time, if the loan can't be repaid, then it's essentially like restarted. And by restarting it, the interest kind of multiplies in a sense because it's continuing to add on to what the previous interest was. It's like a snowball effect. And this happens with credit cards to a degree as well. So the moral of the story is this: the longer that it takes us to pay a loan back, the more we end up paying in the long run. It's the same thing with like our mortgage. Mortgage interest rates are, 3%, but it adds up to tens of thousands of dollars because it's 30 years that we're paying it back for. So if you need to take out some sort of bridge loan from a financial institution, understand what the interest is, but try to make sure you pay it back as soon as possible. Even if that, required payment is pretty low and it sounds like a great deal to only pay a very small dollar amount each month, in the long run, that's really going to make a huge, huge impact to the amount that we pay. So very good question. So as I mentioned a few times here, there are services available to help folks and that we can turn to during these times where we really need to figure out how do we get things on track? How can we explore the right options when it comes to emergencies or challenging financial times? So want to talk about a nonprofit financial counseling organizations, and specifically obviously talk about who we are and what we do. But we have certified professional financial counselors who work with folks either over the phone or in person if they are trying to get on track when it comes to their household budget and just figuring out the best structure for that right now, credit cards, as I mentioned before, and some other issues such as facing difficulty repaying a mortgage. Our hours are Monday through Thursday, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., so fairly flexible. And we also have some time on Fridays from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. that we can help folks. And overall, what our counselors are trying to do is to help people achieve financial peace of mind by giving the right guidance and connecting people to the right resources and the right opportunities to address their specific situation. Our financial counseling is affordable for anybody looking to just get advice and to have a financial counseling session. That is completely free. So it doesn't cost you anything to actually meet with a financial counselor, have them put a budget together, have them help you explore your credit. And they will create a tailored, specific action plan for your situation to help you to know what options would be best for you to explore. Everything is completely confidential, of course, and our counselors are trained to have empathy and understanding and be very motivating in their approach. They're not going to be there, as I said early on, to judge you or to make you feel bad about anything. Many of our counselors have been in the same situation, have come through that, and they kind of draw upon that experience to help their clients. The various types of counseling that we offer, I mentioned budget credit counseling. When I talked about repayment of credit cards, that was our debt management program. We also do first-time home buyer education and counseling and try to get folks connected to resources that can help them buy a home. And then we also are one of the HUD certified foreclosure prevention counseling organizations. And then finally, we also do reverse mortgage counseling and bankruptcy counseling. We also are a part of a program that is run through the city of Rochester called Financial Empowerment Centers. And this provides free one-on-one financial counseling as well as a public service to help people work on issues specifically related to savings, banking, paying down debt, improving their credit, and to do that through more of a coaching style, to do it more long-term if that's needed. So if you were to come in, for example, for a regular credit counseling session, and then you realize, I really need some ongoing help with this, we can connect you with one of our FEC counselors, and they can continue to work with you as long as you want it or need it until you feel like you're on track and you're where you want to be. So more of the story is we have a lot of flexibility in how we can offer assistance and help, and we are doing our best to position ourselves to make sure that that service that's being offered is as relevant and helpful as possible. Real quickly here, as we start to wrap up, each session, with any of the programs that I just mentioned, is about 60 minutes, and the structure is primarily the same. There's going to be a discussion about your goals, what it is you're trying to accomplish, what are your concerns. There's going to be a very detailed budget review conducted. That's what the counselors do all day, every day. They're really super good at it. They will do a debt review, and as I mentioned before, put together a specific action plan for you, where they're going to help craft solutions to get you on track with those goals that you have, so you feel like you are moving forward in an organized and controlled fashion. So I hope that gives some sense and some insight about things that are important to consider right now or during difficult or challenging emergency financial times, and that it gives you some resources that you can turn to be able to get things to the place where you feel it's needed for you. So with that, we'll open it up to our final Q&A, and I'm going to put this evaluation in the chat, and if you are able to complete it, we definitely appreciate it. It's only about 10 questions, not too long. It helps us to be able to continue to improve these types of presentations and services so that we can make them as useful as possible.
Well, we don't have any questions in the chat, so I would like to thank Chad for presenting today. And I hope everyone has a good day in this. And we definitely want to hear from you again. Sorry, my computer's being a little iffy right now. So I'm going to just